Good morning. Hopefully, we have better luck this week with our live. So, this week I had been doing my own inner work, and what came up was around the embodiment and deepening into surrender and letting go. And what's I found interesting is that my own inner work often is reflected in other people, what they're going through, and even in the collective. So I thought it might be interesting today to springboard off of the Handless Maiden, because the Handless Maiden really spoke to this. And I thought that that would give us kind of a segue into using some of the aspects of that story into going a little bit deeper into the resolution of this and how to shift what's often an inherited consciousness, right? So the reason this is so important is that as we transform consciousness in the collective, this is going to be a key, especially if you look at what's happening right now in the culture, and if you're if you've been on a spiritual journey for a long time, then you know, with conversations with friends and others, that the idea of what could happen collectively is it just kind of dovetails perfectly with this. What's interesting about that is that you also see it in the collective. You also can see it in something like the Bible, which I've referenced on various occasions, not to be religious, but because it's like a myth that we live by. And the stories and the myths that, whether we're Christian or not, are things that are kind of baked in to the culture. And in ways that we interpret those stories, it limits us. So the way to transcend the limitations is to become conscious of the story and how the story is, and how, if we're living in aspects of that story, how it is limiting us. So we talked before about the Handless Maiden and the history that she comes from. And if you remember, their family was poor. And that made them, the father in particular, vulnerable to being taken advantage of, because he had this sense of lack in himself. And we talked about it. He was a woodcutter, and they had an apple tree, which, as a woodcutter, you would have thought that would have represented a form of abundance. When you take an apple tree and you find all the seeds in the apple tree, and you could essentially have an orchard from beyond an orchard from just one tree. So there's that kind of inability in that situation. Like, it's like having blinders on. So when you're in that lack consciousness, or you come from a poverty consciousness, you kind of have a very narrow way of seeing. And this isn't even necessarily just a lack or poverty consciousness, but it can be a preference. So there can be, the family has a preference for a certain way of being in the world, and a belief that you have to be a certain way in the world in order to survive or succeed. So this family was in, we'll say, survival mode. That kicks us into, fight or flight. Those things which we hear a lot of people are trying to work through right now. So how can you see if survival mode is at play in your own life? Is to see, where do I not feel free? And if I don't feel free, what is it that I believe the limitation is? What is it about that particular situation that makes me feel that I can't do X, Y, or Z? So is it lack of money, lack of resources, lack of time, lack of energy, right? That's all based on that lack consciousness. Or if you say, why don't you do what you love? And they say, well, I have to be responsible. I have to have a job. I have to do this. Then that is a limitation right there. and the belief that this is what I have to do in order to survive ultimately. So it all kind of boils down to that. So that's how we can begin to parse out whether this consciousness is actually at play in our own lives. Are we living the way we want? Are we limited in some ways? And really exploring those ways that we believe we're limited, exploring the ways that we believe what the limitation is, and then is it true? Number one. Number two, can it be transformed? So in the beginning of the story, we talked about how once the father had sacrificed his daughter, she stood in the circle, right? And we talked about the circle representing a state of consciousness. So where the family was in lack and was looking outside for solutions, she was going in. And the circle symbolizes, in one sense, it symbolizes God, but it can also symbolize wholeness, so spirit, whatever you want to call it. When we're rooted in that consciousness of alignment with source, then we are unmovable. You're not in judgment, you're not in lack, you're not in any of that. And so as long as she stayed in that, remember, then the devil couldn't touch her. And she was present to what came up, which was her emotions. She was going through grief at that time and being in that stillness. So if you for one moment just imagine being in that peace and stillness and silence without thought of lack, without thought of that's a fear, without judgment. If you just stay in that space, then the devil we talked about represents ego. So the ego is the one who comes up with the fears. Oh, you need to do this. Oh, you need to do that. So this is like in Christianity, when Jesus goes into the desert and the devil comes to tempt him, it's right that, so essentially what you could say is that the Father didn't manage to overcome where Jesus did in the desert. So in the desert, the devil is like, oh, you've got to use your power to do this. You've got to do that in order to like take that power and use it in the world. But it's not about that, which the Handless Maiden just demonstrates so beautifully, right? So it's anchoring in that, and she's untouchable from there. So she's in wholeness, which is required to leave the parental consciousness. So we're going to see a variety of keys through the story, and this is one of the keys, is wholeness. So how do I focus on wholeness? So when I come to a point where I feel like there's lack present, then I say, okay, the deeper truth is wholeness. How can that be true? How can I embody that? How can I move through this moment in trust that wholeness is present, that even though my consciousness isn't used to that, even though I'm conditioned to not believe that, it's here, and can I see that and move through it? So in wholeness consciousness, nothing is missing. So there's these levels of truth, and we're shifting here, and what the Handless Maiden is demonstrating, the way to go to a deeper level of truth. So on the one hand, you have the lack, poverty consciousness, and on the other hand, you have wholeness. So this is going to be the way that she's going to move out of that particular consciousness, at least in this moment. And as we saw in Cinderella, there's kind of this back and forth. So we'll see, she's not going to be able to maintain this forever. But in the moment, this is working. This is a way for her to shift out of it. So it's nothing is missing. I have all I need. So how can that be true? I am enough as I am. I am not lacking. I'm not broken. And so I'm enough. I have all I need, and I'm free. So as I was saying before, right, where's that limitation? If there's not the belief that I'm free, then where's the limitation? And it's coming to terms with that, coming to consciousness with that, and then essentially transcending it. So any activity that puts us into a sense of wholeness, right? So it's not, the idea isn't necessarily draw a circle around myself and stand in the middle of the circle, although you could try that. That probably would work as kind of a ritual. But it's going to be whatever puts you into that space, right, of no mind, where there's no judgment. It's timeless, it's spaceless, it's limitless, right? So it's like meditation, creativity, gardening, anything that really opens you up to that, maybe walking in nature, being in nature, and it puts you into that space of non-judgment. That's going to be what's going to put you into wholeness. So when survival mode arises, we are aware of it and then see, is it possible to transition into trust? And that's going to be another key here is trust. Can I trust life? Can I trust the universe? Can I trust source? And this is important because in our culture right now, what is happening is there is this crumbling. So when they say, again, in Christianity, the apocalypse, that destruction is essentially what we're going through, but not in the way it's traditionally interpreted. What it really means is the foundation is shifting. At one point, again, I'm not religious, but in terms of a myth, at one point Jesus says that he is the foundation, and it doesn't mean that Jesus is the foundation. It means that Christ consciousness is the foundation. So there's this shift that's happening personally for us and in the culture, that we're seeing that things are changing, and there's going to be this shift from the traditional way of seeing the world, like I need to rely on my parents, I need to rely on my family, I need to rely on my job, I need to rely on like these things that have always been the foundation. And if you look at it over time, we can see that even in our own lifetimes, for many of us, we've already been seeing this change. Like my father worked for the same company for his whole entire adult life and retired from there. The chances of that happening, even for someone his age, is rare. So the next generation coming down to, and my mother didn't do that, but the next generation coming down was almost always not doing that. We were almost always changing more frequently. And also that there were layoffs, and there was this idea that no longer was that corporation kind of playing that parent role. It was now beginning to shift out of that. So you no longer could depend on the corporation to be there to support you for the rest of your life. So that was the beginning of starting to change that. And we're continuing now, right? People are shifting out of, especially during COVID. They realize, I don't want to go back to that job, and I would rather work for myself. So that identifies just another shift of moving from the old way of looking outside for support and my needs to be met, to beginning to move and shift that to an unseen source, which would be that Christ consciousness. So this is important in terms of letting go of old beliefs and beginning to see a new way. Like, I have to work hard for money. Like, I can't follow my heart because I have to make money. I can't be free to do what I want because I don't have time, energy, resources. I can't play because I have responsibilities, right? If we felt like life supported us, Einstein said this, right? This quote that you hear way too much about, like, is the world, universe friendly or not? If I'm supported, then I am free to follow my heart. I'm free, and I don't have to adhere to the culture that I'm in and the structures of value that the culture places on certain things. So the culture kind of sprung out of a puritanical mindset that was about working hard, and really taking that and looking at it. Is this true? Do I know anybody? Do I see anybody that does not live this way, that doesn't have to adhere to this in order to survive or in order to thrive? And to begin to say, well, then if I can see it, if it is possible for others, then it is also possible for me. So in the Handless Maiden, right, she leaves home and she says to her parents, tie my arms behind my back. I'm going to surrender to Providence. So that's huge, which I talked about before, because surrendering, when you come from that consciousness, can be a challenge, because most likely if you come from the consciousness like she did, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, maybe all have gone through these cycles of challenge in this area. So when you do it, when you try to surrender, it can trigger survival mechanism, which is not a little thing. That would be, am I going to survive? And, that's a pretty big fear. Am I going to survive? So it's just not giving into that and not being afraid of it, but of being aware that that can get triggered so that I know, okay, this is what I might face. And if I do, how do I handle it? And it's knowing that there are ways to transform it. There are ways to overcome it. And I think I've mentioned before, the way that I teach to do this is to just look for the sensation in the body. So if the fear comes up, it's to sit down. I tend to journal, and I go back and forth between the journal and what do I feel in my body? Where is this showing up? And I allow the sensation to be there. I just accept it. Just allow and accept. This is the feeling that's coming up. It isn't even mine. There's so much out there right now on this, there's a variety of different ideas about how many generations things go back, but they've proven that it passes down through the generation through research, the same issues, that the subsequent generations don't even need to experience the original trauma to have it still passed down through the DNA, I guess. So she surrenders her care and to the universe to meet her needs because her arms are behind her back. So this is the way the story demonstrates this, because they're looking for a way to portray it without actually saying the words. So she can't do anything for herself with her hands behind her back. She has no choice. And so this may happen in life. That is why I thought it was so important to talk about this. This has happened in my life. The universe just shuts the doors and you're left sitting in that emptiness, in that void, and not knowing. And so that, as I was saying, can trigger that survival mode mechanism, that to not know, to not see, to not know how are things going to resolve, what's going to happen, how are things going to come to pass, is really allowing that to be there. And like I said, she can't do anything. You may end up in that space too where you can't do anything and you're forced to surrender. Yeah. Can be a little challenging, to be sure. So the family problem is often around controlling, letting go of control. That's a part of surrender, is letting go of control. So if you look back, you might say, oh yeah, she was really good at control. He was really good at control. And you can often see, if this has come down through the generations, who has been attempting to control perfectionism, rigidity, like everything needs to be done this way. I know what's right for you. I know what's wrong, judgment. And so all these things can come up. In survival mode, there's an issue around feeling safe. So that can get triggered as well. And it's really understanding, you're sitting in a space, you're, let's say, sitting in your house. Survival mode is because some, let's say, source goes away that you're used to. And you're sitting in this place of not feeling safe. And it's just allowing that to be there because you understand, I am safe. It's often an overreaction. You'll notice, okay, the response that I'm feeling is just way out of proportion to the situation that I'm in. So again, just looking for the sensation, where is it, and just allowing it to be there and knowing that it's just moving out. It's just like you're witnessing as it comes in and it goes out. So just accepting. So the Handless Maiden does that. She accepts what is, and that's how she moves forward. So she says she's forsaken by all but God. And so the word forsaken actually is defined as abandoned or deserted, right? So that is everything. All those ways of depending on something have been taken away from her. And when she leaves home, that is all she's known. So she goes out into the unknown, which can be a trigger. She goes out into uncertainty, which is a trigger. How is she going to support herself? How is she going to feed herself? How is she going to take care of herself? She has no clue. And yet she's walking right into it. Okay, goes right into it and accepts it and trusts only that. what choice does she have, right? What choice does she have? She's going to have to trust the universe to assist her, to help her, to show her the way. And that's what we have to do too. So this situation will bring up fears of where we're holding on so that we can see them and so that we can let go. The beautiful thing about this is everything that we hold on to in the world is transitory. It all can eventually go away. And so when those things begin to close or crumble and you're shifting into this other way, this is the one thing that will never change, that will never forsake you, that will never abandon you, that will never, right? That is what we want. We want that kind of stability and trust, because then, you know what? You can fly. You can do what your heart makes your heart sing. You can do what you came here to do without any fear, because you know without a shadow of a doubt, this is my support and it's always here. I can always trust it. This happens over time. Faith is built through experience. So seeing that over and over again, what I need will come, what I need will show up. It's expectation and it's trust that this is the way the world works. And it's going to look at nature. Nature is an obvious example. And Jesus did say in the Bible, right? The flowers don't toil and spin, the birds don't store, there's this idea that we can live in life and that life will support us, which we've kind of moved away from. But this consciousness still exists in the world. So when we're not afraid to let go, we're in wholeness, trust that our needs will always be met and we expect it to. This is the consciousness that was really the space when we had coronavirus and went into lockdown. This was what was possible in that space, was to begin to connect to it. So if we look at the symbolism of that, corona, crown is the crown chakra, corona, coronation, that's what that is, the root of that. And then the symbol was the red ball, and that is, again, the circle, which would be God rooting in wholeness. And that's the first chakra. So during that time, we had an opportunity to connect to spirit, to open up the crown chakra and bring it down, and then root into the earth and down into the ground. And that's the first chakra, and bring those two together, right? That's exactly what we're talking about. Spirit as the way to get the needs met. And that's what the first chakra is about, and that's what the crown is about. So it's about bringing those two things together. We talked about this as uniting the opposites, above and the below. This symbolism is also indicative in 9/11. That also was symbolically showing us, they were like, these events are like dreams from the collective. And in 9/11, what you had was the twin towers coming down. So twin means doubling, which we've talked about, like with sisters. And that means it's important to individuation. So in the tarot, the tower card is when the ego comes back down to earth, head out of the clouds, comes down to earth. And when you see what's at the site now in New York City, what they have is this thing called the oculus. So the oculus in architecture, in Roman architecture, is often in the rotunda in a cathedral, and there's a circle at the top of the rotunda. And so if you go in, you look up, usually if it's not open, you'll see there's something else there, like it could be a painting or something, but you'll see a circle. And that is the idea, is that God's looking in at the congregation. But in New York City, what's happened is they have a building now, they call it the Oculus. And when you go in, what I saw was it appeared like an eye that was opening. And what you saw were these ribs, like across the top. You can't really see that. These ribs were on the top of the building. And it was like you were looking up and there was glass all along it, like an eye opening, right? The eyelashes opening up. That's the way I saw it, especially since they called it an oculus. Makes sense. And so what's different is that, again, in that architectural sense, God is looking down. And now what we have is you're inside and God is looking out, right? So that's the crown chakra opening up, bringing spirit inside, not in the sky, but inside, so that it can perceive through our this vehicle, ourselves, our bodies, our consciousness. So it's bringing those two things together. And then additionally there, what they have is they have two fountains that are black squares where the water falls in. So in a traditional fountain, you often have, it's a circle with the water coming up like this, which is phallic symbol. But here we have this 4 is a square, and that is the earth. That's what that symbolizes. And so we have the water falling in as opposed to out. So it's a more feminine thing happening here. So we can see that these things are really talking as dreams about what the collective is going through. And it is this shift into an embodiment of spirit, of source, and allowing that consciousness to be primary. Examples of this are real. I mean, like, people are actually living this way. I can't claim that I am yet, but there are people, like, you might have heard the story of Peace Pilgrim, where she walked across the United States. I don't remember all the details of it. I read the book years and years ago, but she walked across the United States and with a comb in her back pocket. Everything she needed was met day after day: food, water, where to sleep, like stuff to sleep with. I mean, just every single day her needs were met. Another one is Findhorn community in Scotland, and their story about how they began was he lost his job. Actually, they all did. He and his wife and the secretary all lost their jobs, and he was going for job opportunities, and no one would hire him. And so he went to the welfare office, and they were like, "We keep sending you on these job interviews, and you're completely qualified. Why isn't anybody hiring you?" He says, "I don't know. It must be God." And they said, "Okay, well, fine. Then let God support you." And he was like, okay, like, what else could he say? And so they had to surrender. Again, no choice. They were living in a caravan, which is a camper in a camping park in Scotland. And it was, gorse and rocks and sand. And he started a garden, because what choice did they have? And everything they needed just showed up. Everything they needed when they showed up. And then another one is The Biggest Little Farm. If you haven't seen the movie yet, the documentary, I highly recommend it. It's so good. I've watched it a couple of times at least. And my favorite part is when they have this problem where the trees are being inundated with snails. And the guy who's the farmer sits down and is kind of like, okay, we have this issue. And they were trying to just take buckets and pluck them off, and it was just overwhelming. There were just so many snails. And he was sitting one day, and he looked, and he saw that the ducks at the pond were eating the snails. So they gathered up the ducks, and they took them to the orchard, and the ducks were like toot, 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 eating all the snails. So that's like this idea that when I can just see what's here in wholeness, I have all I need. It's here. And so like I said, when we have this idea that we're limited and that we don't have enough, then we're like this. But when you take that away, those blinders, and you begin to open them up and say, okay, if I have everything I need and I look at what's right here, how can I see this as different? How can I see this as true? And just start asking questions of how I can deepen into this greater truth. You may be surprised. I don't know. Other people have done it, so it's entirely possible. Let's see. So Handless Maiden, when she got married, if you remember, she went into that warrior consciousness, got triggered with her husband. So then they were in that survival mode. He went off to war. The messages got mixed up. There was this kill the maiden. And so that caused her to go into that cottage, which is where she reconnected with spirit. So what had happened was she got married, she got triggered, which we talked about. Like, that's great. Relationships can just kick up everything that you've got in the unconscious. And so she was in that, and he was in that, and she had to go connect with spirit to begin to build that relationship with spirit in a way that she could completely trust. And that's when her hands grew back. So she has agency again. Then she knows, I don't have to depend on anybody. I don't have to depend on my husband. I don't have to depend on my parents. I don't have to depend on a job. I have support in source. So doing what you love is a key. My guides talk about this all the time. They say it all the time. Do what you love, do what you love, do what you love. It changes your consciousness. Doing what you love, because you open up into that space. And I was talking about that, like meditative space. And that is where the healing energy of source comes through. So people say, in meditation, it does, in that it does, because you're aligning with a higher truth. It's like an embodiment of spirit or source. So the Handless Maiden is no longer dependent. So to finish up, what happened for me this week as I went deeper into surrender and letting go was I was talking to a friend and talking to her about this, and I always read her a poem before we hang up. She's just a lovely person. And so I just randomly opened up my poetry book, and I began to read, and the two of us were practically crying. So if you're in this place, if you have the book, it's Butterfly. If you don't, I highly recommend it. It's all the poetry is channeled, so it is really speaking to these changes in consciousness that we're undergoing, and it gives, like the fairy tales, it kind of gives you this path through the transitioning through these challenges is such a hard limiting word through these old inherited consciousness. There you go. That doesn't have any judgment in it. Okay, butterfly. Butterfly, show me the way to love and to freedom and just how to play. You came into this world in a form that wasn't you. You had to let go of what you thought was true. The days and the nights had become all the same. You knew you had to change. There was no one to blame. You turned your gaze from day to night, stopped looking out, and turned to inner sight. The fears, they grew as all you thought was you crumbled and dissolved, disappearing from your view. The darkness, it got louder as all that was your past fell away from you, every shackle to the last. The ground you thought you knew, that was your entire world, became nothing but dust as the new you unfurled. The seed of freedom, planted so long ago in the heart of the caterpillar, ever so slowly did grow, compelling it to leave all it had believed, surrendering to trust what it couldn't see. Asleep to the world as it became something new, deep inside the soul while hidden from our view. The heart began to quicken, dancing to a new tune, preparing for a rebirth like a flower set to bloom, emerging from the dark of the distant past. What was is no more. The old form wasn't to last. The beauty it unfurled in the bright sunny light. The wings grew firm and strong to prepare it for the flight. Poised at the edge of all that was known, that which was believed and thought of as home. Let go of everything and rise above on the wings of inspiration and the breath of love. You can see, isn't that crazy? I just love how life works. Sometimes it is so magical. It's absolutely. Yes. Spirit has your back. Source has your back, however you want to look at it. Yep. So if you're interested in kind of reviewing this again, either this video or going back now to Handless Maiden, and if you're in trying to embody this consciousness and shift this in your own self, and you have some challenges around this, you can go back to the Handless Maiden and watch those videos again, and you'll see it at another level, and probably much deeper this time, because this piece is kind of been pulled out and really focused on. And I think this is really one of the big things that story is speaking to. I'm telling you, the poems are amazing, the stories are amazing, all here to assist us. Look at that. Like, does life have your back? Does Source have you? Well, think about it. Like, when all the right people or all the right experiences or all the right situations just happen to just magically show up at exactly the right time. Like, my friend called at exactly the right moment for me to tell her what was going on. I got another level of clarity, which is how this whole talk this morning came together. And then at the end, just randomly opened the book to this poem that happened to encapsulate everything that we had just talked about. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just beyond conception. So something, whatever your belief system is, something is doing this. Something is making this happen. You know, it's probably too limiting to call it Source or God or whatever, but something is doing this and helping us and guiding us and showing us the way and bringing us just what we need at just the right time. And so you need a little bit of extra support, slide that in. So yeah, okay, I said it. Well, I hope you join me next week, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a great rest of your Saturday.